Hey there, Ryan Kingsline here. In this video, I want to talk to you a little bit about doing a killer render out of substance. Now, why am I talking about substance? The key thing, and this is happening a lot with my digital sculptor friends, is we're trying to find a way to do something beautiful, something really cool for Instagram or just to show off all the hard work that we do inside of ZBrush. And to be frank, ZBrush renders suck, right? Dealing with that is not anywhere near as powerful as what we can get out of substance. And somebody might argue with me on that, but I used to work there. I was part of it, and I know BPR filters better than most people. It's not as powerful as substance for me, all right? And the capacity for me to get in here and to create renders like the one you're seeing right here that have this kind of gravitas, this depth, is really important. And to me, there's more you can do here than in Keyshot, for example, because of some of the capacity inside of substance. So how do you do that? How do you create some killer cinematic materials or renders? That's what I want to talk to you about today. So there's a couple of things you need to know right off the bat. Right off the bat, you need to be aware, and you have to excuse me, the screen is a little bit, let's turn that to base color. We'll put that there. This screen is incredibly small because I'm doing this for recording, so smaller than I normally do it. Now, the way this works for me, I use basic materials, but I like to use smart materials. Why do I like to use smart materials? And by basic material, I mean I like to use materials within substance to start the whole conversation off. But I like to use smart materials because smart materials will use my maps. And the maps are really important, right? And I've already gone through here and baked these things out. So if you go into this texture setting area right here, if you scroll down, you see this bake mesh area. I used to just use low poly as high mesh, but now I don't do that anymore because I actually want to capture normal map detail and I want to capture, curvature and a bunch of other things. So I will always make sure that I have a high res and a low res, and the low res is a little different than the high res. So I capture that. But that's the key. Key number one, you need to have maps. You need to bake out your normal map. You need to bake out your world space, your ID, your ambient occlusion, and you need to bake out your curvature. Okay, super important to have that curvature there, to have some information inside of the normal map. It doesn't have to be a ton, just some. Thickness, mildly useful. Ambient occlusion, incredibly useful. But for me, and in this case, the one that's going to be the most powerful is curvature. All right, so, and I'm going to show you how that works, okay? But first, right off the bat, how do we start to develop simple materials? Now, notice, in this particular case, if you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice I've got some issues inside of the UVs, right? These things are coming together and it's going to cause a problem. The assumption I have here is that you want to create, you're basically trying to outrun, outgun, outmaneuver resistance, or one of the million different things happening in life. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get something beautiful as quick as humanly possible so that you can get the idea out of yourself. You're not focused on production. So I leave problems like this alone because when I have an hour and a half in the morning and I want something beautiful, the UVs are the last of my concern. My concern is getting something before the kids wake up, right? So I want to get in and get something beautiful, something powerful. So I'll go through here and I'll just start to play clever monkey with this. Okay, what is some material that might lend itself to the conversation? I don't know. Leather, seat, old and dry, leather, old and dirty. Why don't we throw that into the conversation? Okay, let's just throw that right on and see what happens. Okay, it's going to take its sweet little time in there. And this is a smart material, and the smart material is really a folder. And a folder has various things in there, such as leather base. And leather base is most likely going to be just this basic material. Like you can see leather big, leather bag, leather rough. It's going to be real simple things like that. And then there'll be masks and fill layers on top of that. Now, this lecture is not all about getting you into the ins and outs of that kind of thing, but let's just go through here and I say, I'm going to create my own smart folder or my own smart material. I'm going to come into leather rough. Let's throw leather rough in there. No, I don't like leather rough. That's a little too hardcore. Let's go leather bag. Leather bag, maybe. What about leather medium grain? Kind of like leather medium grain. Let's delete that. Leather rough. And then I'm going to throw leather medium grain inside of this folder so that it will start to take effect. And then the next thing I will do is I'll start to add in some fill layers. And I will start to add in masks to it. So let's add a black mask. And then let's come into that black mask and add a generator. And then in the generator, we'll come down and we'll select a mask editor. And in this mask editor, let me just pull this up here. I like to go down here a bit, and I like to make sure that that curvature is really being pulled in. Okay. Now the way Substance works is they use the term layer stack, and the layer stack is a collection of, it's a set of things. So in this particular case, it's a series of channels. It's color, it's height, roughness, and all of these are just layered on top of each other along with all the layers for that. So let's go into roughness. Okay. Roughness is coming from all these different, I'm so uninterested in teaching this. Okay, roughness in this case is really coming from that curvature. So if we take this down a bit, you can see that roughness is just completely disappearing because of what we've done here. So this curvature setting here, this is pulling, you might notice that there's a curvature, an ambient occlusion, and a world space. It's pulling from the curvature map, the world space map, the position, the ambient, all of that to give us this different quality. But not only that, you got to keep in mind there's these extra elements to it. So if I come into the layer itself, notice that I've got a color, height, rough, metal, right? There's a whole series of items down here. Keep your eye there, right? Now, as I go through and I start to check things off, you'll get a little sense of what happens. Let's check off roughness. Right? They're just going to turn that right off. As soon as I turn off roughness, nothing that I do inside of this particular channel is going to affect roughness. And since I'm looking at roughness, but yet no, this whole thing, which is the channel that's basically applying all of these effects to it, since it has roughness turned off, then none of that information is transferring into roughness. Will it translate into base color? Let's take a look. Let's change this over to base color. Yes, it does. But as soon as I come down here into this little section and I turn color off, boom, it's gone. And now the only color I'm getting is the color that I get from the leather material, right? So this is how we build a material, our own smart materials inside a Substance, to help us get a just a different feel for things. You build your fill layers with your different masks and your different generators. Okay, sometimes you can just go in and you can just choose, let's say dust, or you can find different elements or different things that you can add into there. I like to add in just a mask editor, and then I'll apply dust and do all of that kind of stuff from scratch here. Okay, but we don't want to look at this one and build this from scratch. Let's turn on the one that I already built, the one that's already kind of designed to work with this. And you can see that one starts with a leather rough. And the leather rough, if I've got that selected, notice that in the layer stack, it's doing color, height, rough, metal, and normal map. Okay? If you're not following where exactly I am, wherever your eye is, take it down into the corner. Color, height, rough, metal, normal. So those are all the channels that the leather rough is transmitting. Okay? Now, if I come in and if I turn rough off, well, that's going to affect this render. And now suddenly I'm getting a lot of specular. If I turn height off, that beautiful bump goes off, because now I'm no longer getting any more of this height information, which you can get under the technical properties here. You see the height range. You see down here in the corner, the corners where you want to be looking. Notice that those numbers, man, I dialed those things like way, 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 way down to get just the sense of some noise in there. All right, just a little bit of noise, not too much. All right, but I want roughness in there. That's what we got this for. I want height in there because that's what we got. That's why we use leather rough, right? But in order to sell this leather rough and the rest of these things, you know, notice if I come in here and let's say, where is that fill layer? I think this one's largely irrelevant because it's underneath this leather rough, which is taking things over. But let's turn this one on. There we go. I don't know if you can see this. Let's zoom in a little bit, and I want you to catch it here. I had to throw the normal map on, you know, the normal map where I get a little bit of extra detail in this. I had to throw that into a fill layer, and the fill layer transmitted normal, and it transmitted height and normal. And then if you scroll down, that fill layer, it's transmitting normal, and that's coming from the normal map that I generated that has a little bit of these extra wrinkling and rake marks left in there, right? This is where I really start to drill in and get some of the beauty of the model. And this is going to show up later on when we start to do our IRay render, you know, but without this, it's okay. It's just, it misses the punch, especially in the stomach area where I really used and relied on the normal map to translate some of that detail. Okay, so in order for me to make a really killer render inside a substance, hopefully what you've gotten out of this is you need to bake your high res and your low res, and you need a curvature, you need ambient occlusion, and you need something in your normal map. Just some information that's going to pop up and help me describe some of the details of it. This is what we rely on. All right, now then on top of that, I put a simple color. If you come in there to this layer that's above leather rough, and you go down to the property setting, you see the only thing I'm transmitting is color. I just wanted it to overwrite that color. Then I go in and I have a tiny little mask applied. So I have a black layer coming in with a mask. This mask is using a ton of roughness, a ton of curvature, a ton of ambient occlusion, and that entire layer is translating, well, really just rough. That's all it's doing. I'm using this layer to turn off specular or any kind of brightness in the recesses. All right. Are you with me now? We got the map. The map's created. We have basic smart material that we created using basic materials inside of substance like leather rough, and then throwing on a color layer, and then throwing on another fill layer with our normal map, and then throwing on another layer that's just going to transmit roughness information and help us really dial this thing in. Now we get ourselves into IRay. So we come over here into rendering, and this is where you get the real-time shadows. This is what you need. You need this and real-time shadows to start this conversation. But now the conversation I want to have with you is, how do you start to get something that's cinematic? Because when you start this, it doesn't look like this thing is. You know, it doesn't look like this at all. And instead, it's looking, a little bit more generic, right? And I've got my width and height set quite high, so I set these to 3960 by 2160 so that it's double HD. That gives me enough pixels to be able to resize and do all kinds of stuff to it. But for right now, I'm going to set this downwards. I'm going to set this back to 980, and I'm going to set this to 1020, just so that for the sake of this video, it's not spending enormous times calculating. You can see it's kind of already started to calculate faster, and you can keep track of that here in the iterations, 8, out of 5,000. And I've set the minimum sample at 10, and I've set the max time at 10, so it stops right there. If you change min sample or max time, any one of those, then it will simply keep going to whichever one is the highest. That's how it defaults. Okay, the first key to developing a cinematic render is choosing an awesome HDR. So if I come in here and I set, let's say, this guy, and in fact, let me set these kind of back to normal. In fact, I don't even know what normal would be on these. I've adjusted these things, you know, so far. Let's set that to 160. Yeah, I think about 100. Anyways, somebody will let me know in the comments below this video what is actually the normal. But this is what we're going to adjust next, is the radius and the texture. We're going to get those in. And I like to turn clear color on, and I set that to black, so I'm not dealing with, you know, this thing in the background. And then let me turn off my activate effects, and let me make sure that my post effects. And let me check to see, yeah, the exposure is at about 1, so we're in okay space there. Okay, so yeah, we're good. Now, I turn on pretty much right away clear color. That's kind of important to me. Let's check here if there's anything we need to adjust. No. And I want to do one more look to see if there's any gamma or anything that we're adjusting, and there's not. All right, so you know, this is okay, this is pretty decent, but you know, I'm not sold on it. It's not doing a ton for me. If we're looking at the whole thing, you know, it's okay. Definitely the map is transferring a lot of detail. I'm getting some nice shadows, and those are definitely calculating quite well. So you know, for the most part, looks cool, but I want some more control. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to start looking at some of these other HDRIs to see what kind of really works, you know, and you can always rotate them. But for me, the real power I have seen comes in coming down here and starting to explore some of these kind of simpler HDRIs. And the one that I like that creates very cinematic lighting is lit almost entirely from above. Like that. There you go. And see, that's quite beautiful, right? I really like that. And keep in mind, if you start to lose any ground like this, you know, just come in here and lower your ground, and you'll get that back. So, it depends on, well, it depends on whatever. Who cares, right? Just put the number in, and you'll be in better shape for that. Okay, so choose an HDRI that's really lit from above. That's a key component to this. Okay, then you can come in and you can adjust the environment rotation to see, hey, can I get a really nice side light or a rim light or something of that nature. But the next step to this is you come down into dome, and I'll use a sphere with ground, not infinite sphere or anything like that. I use sphere with ground, and then I'll come into this radius and I start to lower the radius. But I'm lowering the radius and keeping it in check with texture scale, because if your texture scale goes the other direction, you start to undo the effect of this. So it's like these guys have a happy medium. So I'll set this to 10, and I'll bring that radius down. At a certain point, it's going to flip. It's going to undo and have a different effect. So if I set this at 10 as well, then it might, you know, just start to go the other direction. Oops, not what I wanted. Let's set that to 17, and I'm going to set this to 16. Okay, and if you're not getting the results that I'm getting here, there's a couple of things that we need to start to think about. But before we get there, let's just, yeah, and then get some nice dark lighting to it. There we go. Okay. And then I'll come in and I will start to work with the ground. I'll start to move these around. This is a nice way for you to start to move the light around, sort of. You can start to move it left or right or backwards or forwards and start to have the light kind of creep around the side. So for example, if we set it way back there, -7, that's not quite the result. We start to lose the light, right? And probably as I was doing this, you were like, Ryan, it's not lit. How are you going to light it? What's going on? Well, this is what I do, is I move the light around using ground to kind of get it right over the top and start to create a little bit more of a cinematic quality. Let's try the light in the opposite X. See? Yeah, there we go. It's pretty crazy what you can do, and I'm going to dial that back a little bit. There we go. Okay, and you can see all the lightness showing up in here, so you just got to let this resolve itself a little bit. And let's go back to our exposure. I'm going to set that back to 1 because we're going to adjust that here in a moment in another place. So this is pretty cool, but now I got to come down here and I got to activate post effects, and let me turn all of these off so I can give them one at a time. Throw some vignette in there and whatever it is, just let it be. Anti-aliasing, yes, no. What I really like, though, the thing that I think is really cool, is you come in here and you start to do a tone mapping. So I'm going to turn tone mapping on, and as soon as you do that, it's going to start to do some crazy. So you got to like back it up, and so I'm going to increase the exposure. Let's set that at 1.7. And then I like to go in and start to play with these. Like linear sat is pretty cool. Reinhard is pretty cool. Then there's the log lum. Those are all kind of roughly the same. The one I ultimately liked for this was heading it to sensitimetric and seeing, and then this gamma we can adjust back and forth. So again, you might have started this and you're like, Ryan, it's super dark, right? But that's the point. We want to use this. Let me zoom in the other direction. We want to use these settings to caress the light over the model. And if you don't know these settings, then sometimes you just don't know how far you can kind of take this, and you might be looking for the HDRI to do all of the hard work. And the HDRI image is just, it's just not doing the hard work, that you necessarily want. So I'm going to position this. Let's say, that's a nice silhouette that I like. And there we go. So I got a nice silhouette that I like. I got a nice sense of the lighting coming in. Let's get a little bit more darkness. Yeah, right like that. Okay. I got my exposure coming up to about a 1.9. The sensitimetric is in there. And I got some good gamma on this to get resolved. But I'm going to take that gamma down a little bit because I like having a dark area and a light area. Yeah, there we go. And at this point, the numbers are very small. Like what you deal with, super, 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 super small elements. Let's go and turn that anti-aliasing on. We can come into color correction. And in color correction, I use that to undo a couple of different things too. So I increased the brightness overall because I wanted to get a little bit more. You can throw some contrast in, but be very careful. 1.1 has a huge impact. 1.001, work your numbers. Don't just go in and go crazy. 0.005, yeah. And then does that work? Yeah, that's interesting. All right, and so now I need to let this thing render to be able to get a better result. So I need to set my minimum samples or something of that nature, and just set this to 180. It doesn't matter which one you adjust. Whichever one you adjust is just going to start going to town. But we'll let this thing render, and then we'll come back to see what we managed to get out of substance. And it's really just a way for you and me as artists, not digital sculptors, not character artists, not environment artists, just flat artists. I'm just an artist, and I want to and I'm a 3D artist, and I want to take a damn good photograph of my work. I'm sick and tired of some matte cap or, dealing with some element in Keyshot that's just too global. I want more depth and more control, but I don't want to get into Arnold or V-Ray or something like that where now suddenly, you have more overhead in terms of your setup. I just want something where I can get in and I can start to just create a beautiful picture of my work, something cinematic. I'm having a hard time saying that. All right. And you can see this already starting to resolve itself, a little bit better. So we can go in and we can start to adjust the settings. I'm not going to do it now because I think this is definitely good enough for us to understand. And for some reason it's saving. There we go. So we could go in and we could add some aperture. We can do all of that kind of stuff to help get this a little bit nicer. You can come back into your radius and drop that down to get a bit of a harder light, because that's really what that does. And then you could also come in and you can move your environment with environment rotation just to move where that light is. But hopefully this is showing you a way to use substance to get some pretty cinematic and hopefully beautiful imagery for your digital sculpts. All right, have fun, and I'll see you on the other side.